this weekend at Garma. We've heard a lot over the last couple of days about what the community feels, what the community thinks, what the community wants, what the community demands, and so much of that falls to the people who are up here on the stage with me today to be able to address the challenges that face Indigenous Australia. And there was a challenge laid down in a speech given last night by a man with a distinguished political career, Fred Shayne, someone who served in the Australian Parliament for more than 20 years, who was the former Deputy Leader of the Opposition, also a one-time Minister for Indigenous Affairs, amongst a whole range of other portfolios. And Fred Shayne bemoaned the state of political leadership in Australia today. And I can tell you from speaking to people here just over the past couple of days, it's a sentiment that is widely shared as we look at the situation that faces Indigenous Australia, the racism issue that's been very much focused on this week around the booing of Adam Goodes, and the general malaise that people see amongst our parliaments, state and federal, a slavish observance of opinion polls, a timidity, a lack of leadership, and a lack of commitment to grasp meaningful reform. So all of those issues are going to be raised up here on the stage today. Let me introduce who we have. Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Tudge. Alan, as I say, came into Parliament in August in 2010, was appointed to his current role following the 2013 election. Senator Peris, who's here as well, needs no introduction, extraordinary individual, extraordinary feats in athletics and hockey, and also now in the Senate for the Australian Labor Party. Warren Snowden here as well, the Parliamentary Secretary for Indigenous Affairs and Northern Australia, Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Shayne Neumann, and Rachel Seiwart, the Greens Senator for Western Australia. Let me start with Alan Tudge. And Alan, I'm going to go straight to the criticism that Fred Shayne delivered last night across a whole range of areas where he identifies what he sees as a lack of leadership. In fact, he said there is more leadership coming from the 3% of Indigenous Australians than there is coming from the people who are elected to represent them. How do you respond to that? And Fred's
that's a good opening question, Stan, isn't it? I mean, I have immense respect for Fred Shayne. He's a friend of mine, and I consider him a mentor in my current role. It is terrific that there is such great Indigenous leadership, and on Indigenous issues we more and more seek Indigenous leadership to help shape the direction and help shape our policy. I won't agree entirely, of course, with Fred Shayne in terms of saying there's a lack of overall political leadership. I think that from the federal level, at the governments, we've laid down some very clear markers, at least in relation to our core priorities, and done some important structural changes as well, which I think set us up in the future to be able to engage more deeply, to listen more closely, and get better outcomes on the ground.
Well, Alan, I'm glad that you acknowledge the leadership of Indigenous Australia, because we had some Indigenous leaders on a panel that I chaired earlier this morning, where they represent their communities across Northern Australia, and they all made the same complaint, that despite the words and the rhetoric, that there is no follow-through, that the collaboration, the cooperation and the negotiation that you just talked about is not happening.
Well, again, I would disagree with that. I mean, between Nigel Scullion, who is deeply entrenched with Indigenous communities, myself, where a big part of my role is working with Indigenous communities, and indeed the Prime Minister himself. We've never had a Prime Minister who's been so engaged with Indigenous communities. Now, we can always do more, of course we can, and we do need to do more, and Nigel Scullion talked about a new way of engaging. But at the same time, we've got other structures in place. We have an Indigenous Advisory Council in place. We just brought together 40 important leaders to our constitutional recognition roundtable at Kirribilli. So at every step of the way we are seeking to engage, but also set a clear direction around our three priorities of school attendance, adults working and community safety, along with constitutional recognition.
Shayne Neumann, I don't want this to be partisan, and the criticism no doubt applies across both major parties. The criticism, I'm sure when Labor was in, was that despite the goodwill, despite the financial commitment, despite the pleadings of Indigenous communities that these problems remain intractable, that we can spend the billions of dollars each year on Indigenous affairs. We can do that for generations, and we can still see Indigenous people occupying the bottom rung of every socio-economic indicator in the country. We can have a situation where Indigenous youths are more likely to end up behind bars than they are to graduate university. Is that not an indictment on the political process and the political leadership across all the major parties for generations?
Well, we can do a lot more, Stan, in relation to this, and I'm always prepared to listen to the sage advice from Fred. He's never afraid to tell me what he thinks. And there are many respected Indigenous leaders. We heard great speeches yesterday, and we heard great work being done. Sean Gordon, Joe Morrison, for a start, the work that they are doing in their respective communities. But I don't know where Alan's been in the last couple of years, because the Abbott government seems to think you can cut your way to closing the gap. I mean, the rhetoric is there, but what we've seen is more than $500 million cut from frontline services. You can't address entrenched issues of disadvantage, discrimination, dispossession of land without actually the commitment in terms of finance behind it. And further, in terms of the incarceration and victimisation and the shocking rates of abuse, well, I've got to say, in opposition, the coalition said that they would agree with the development of a justice target in closing the gap. In government, they have done nothing of the sort. They've backed away entirely.
Well, I need to get a response to that from Alan. You have cut $500 million from the budget. That has imperilled remote communities. In the session we did this morning, those remote communities expressed the frustration that they feel about phrases such as lifestyle choices and the potential for closing their own communities.
Oh, a few issues there. We haven't cut $500 million. We did make savings of about half of that amount, and we admit to that. But if money was the answer to closing the gap, we would have closed the gap years ago, Stan, because we've had a 80% real increase in funding over the last 10 years. That's money which we've made savings towards as a result of enormous debt and deficit which we were left, constitutes about 0.2% of the overall expenditure on Indigenous people in the country. Now, with all due respect to Shayne, I don't think that 0.2% is the difference between closing the gap and not closing the gap. In relation to the broader comment you're making, Stan, which is a bigger discussion about closing communities, that was never the language which we used at the federal government.
The language that was used was lifestyle choices, and that came from the Prime Minister, and we heard this morning exactly what people thought of that phrase.
Listen, in some respects, all of us have choices about where we want to live, and Aboriginal people, of course, have choices about where they want to live, including always on their traditional land. I mean, our view is, of course, your choices are amplified, they're enhanced when you have a good education and when you have work. And in some of the very small communities, it is very difficult to get a good education and to get a good job. And that's the broader discussion which I think the Western Australian government is trying to have as it negotiates and engages over the next decade in relation to the very, very small communities.
We can pursue some of that here today. And I have to point out, Alan is at a distinct disadvantage today, numerically at least, because he is the sole representative of the coalition. George Brandis, the Attorney General, was... Well, there you go. Well, he does have the power of government, so that at least maybe makes up some of the shortfall. George Brandis was going to be here today, but couldn't make it, so it was not a stacked panel. It was going to be balanced, but of course, Alan, unfortunately, you have to carry the load today.
I'll do my best.
Rachel Seiwart, I can hear you muttering under your breath. I know there's a lot of things you want to get off your chest, but I do also want to come to this fact, and as Alan has pointed out, that in circumstances that Australia finds itself in today, where it simply does not bring in enough money to be able to pay for what goes out, when right across the board there are reductions that are going to have to be made. Does that not apply to Indigenous communities? Is there not also an accountability when it comes to the viability of those communities?
So there's one area, there's a number of things I want to touch on.
Oh, I could tell. I could hear you.
First off, the government ignores revenue measures to actually bring in money, and they always think it's about making cuts. So for a start, that's that's a significant issue. Secondly, the government should never have considered cutting Aboriginal funding when we know already that we are significantly behind meeting our closing the gap targets in order to close the gap in life expectancy about 2030. And if we continue on our present trajectory, we won't. And so I completely reject the issue about it's not about money. It is about money, but also about how we spend that money and how we make the decisions about how we spend that money. The government continues to make, and they did exactly this through the Indigenous Advancement Strategy. They continue to make top-down decisions that don't involve the community, or, heaven forbid, we should consider the evidence about what works. And now, a classic example of failure to deliver on time and to case of how things fail is that in 2011, the then government made a decision to invest $13 million in dialysis in Central Australia, and we all said, fantastic. On Thursday, the present government finally announced that money being delivered, and it's only 10 million, by the way, not the original 13 million that was promised. So that's 4 years of continuing failure to provide the accommodation and dialysis that's needed in Central Australia. If we continue along that current trajectory, we will never meet our targets to close the gap.
Alan, we're not going to play tic-tac-toe. I can't come back to you for a response to everything, but I will go to Nova Peris. Yes, money is important, but we also have to acknowledge that a lot of money has been spent, and we still have the parlous situation, the apparently intractable problems that Indigenous people face. Is it money, or is it the delivery of services, the bureaucracy that fails, and the lack of collaboration and communication and negotiation with communities?
I think it's
Just move that a little bit across. Yeah, thank you.
I think it's all of above, Stan. I put my hand up for politics because I wanted to make a difference, and I sit here and listen as an Aboriginal woman, and I've been here many times to the Garma festivals where you have the incredibly smart, intelligent, articulate Yolngu people that are screaming out to say, we have the answers, we have the solutions. And it's 2015, and we at a national level are having discussions about racism in this country. That is a sad indictment of this country. I think consecutive governments, and I say this not lightly, will have...
Do you include Labor governments in that as well?
I'm saying consecutive governments, we will continue to have, when you talk about high suicide rates, violence, the high incarceration rates, all these things are all curable and preventable with the investment down here. It's almost like we will continue to have blood on our hands while an Aboriginal person is not in the driver's seat. And to try and make a very simple sort of analysis of all this, if I'm driving down a dirt road here and I'm in the driver's seat and I've got a car full of Yolngu people, this isn't my country, it's not my car, I don't know where I'm going, and I continue to sit in the goddamn driver's seat rather than having the local people drive their agenda in life. And I get really angry about that because I'm sick and tired of having this conversation. It's because, and it's embarrassing, when I sit as now we've got Joanna Lingram, who's a member of the Senate, she's Liberal, but you've got all these people that come with the solutions, and they've been screaming out, we've got the answers. Why? I don't want to drive. I don't want to drive. This is not, yes, as an Aboriginal person, but there are so many people who are saying, let us sit in the driver's seat. What is so bad about removing ourselves and letting an Aboriginal person for the first time be empowered, sitting in the car seat, driving the vehicle on their road to their destiny?
Warren Snowden, picking up on what Nova has said, is this not what the Prime Minister has also said? Is this not what the Prime Minister is also trying to achieve when they say that we need to cut the layers of bureaucracy, reduce the number of bodies, have an Indigenous advisory body inside his office giving him direct advice? Is that not consultation and negotiation?
No, it's not. And what it is a facade, really, because
I don't know if Warren Mundine would necessarily agree that it's
Well,
facade.
I don't care what Warren Mundine thinks. I'm just telling what I think. I think it's a facade. It's not a representative organisation. It doesn't come from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. It doesn't represent their interests. It can't be seen to represent their interests. There is a national representative body, the National Congress, which the government ignores and is defunded. I mean, let's be very clear here. The government's taken very deliberate decisions to sideline the voice of Aboriginal people. But there is some good things happening, and I just want to come to one of them. There's a very successful sector in this country. Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations are extremely successful. They are successful because they are owned, controlled and run by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That's not to say they don't have to adhere to strict governance requirements and a whole range of other matters that you'd expect probity to demand. But in terms of health, we've made measurable improvements in health outcomes as a direct result of investments in Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations. They are the best examples of comprehensive primary health care in this country. Now, it's not too far to go, to sort of jump around and say, well, we can do this in the Aboriginal health sector. Why can't we do it elsewhere? And why don't we trust Aboriginal people, as Bill Gray was saying this morning, to make those decisions for themselves in their home locations? This is not just about having some body at the top. This is about going to people sitting in the dirt and accepting that their priorities are ones which you need to address. And we've seen the result of the intervention in the Northern Territory. Des Rogers has spoken about it. The chair of the Northern Land Council spoke about its impact upon him. Well, what happened was that Aboriginal organisations were gutted. Aboriginal men were demonised. And as a direct result, they were powerless. Now, what we've got to do is rebuild the trust from government with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in a fair exchange where they are partners, not collaborators, partners. And they have the right to be sitting at the table making the decisions about their lives. And at the moment, that's not happening.
I'm sure that Alan Tudge may want to remind you that Labor continued the intervention under a different guise, but I'll get him to respond to that.
I don't apologise for. Let me be very, very clear. The Labor government made mistakes, very clear, and Nova referred to them. I don't apologise. I say we shouldn't have done those things. But we're now today. We need to be looking forward and how we can deal with things as they are today and make changes which will affect people's lives into the future.
Okay, a couple of things, Alan. First of all, we'll go to the question of the Indigenous Advisory Council that the Prime Minister has in his office, that it is not representative. If you can address that, but also the question of the defence of the intervention, why you thought it was necessary, what you believe may have been achieved.
The Indigenous Advisory Council is a very good advisory body. It doesn't seek to be representative. It seeks to have people who bring different skills to the table to be able to provide advice directly to government. And certainly Warren Mundine, as the chair, does so on a very regular basis, meeting with the Prime Minister constantly, meeting with myself and Nigel Scullion constantly. And we've got other members of the Indigenous Advisory Council here, including Andrew Penfold's over there, Josephine Cashman, and Jawa is here Jumbawa is here as well, I believe. The second point in relation to the intervention. It was a decision which was made, which was seen as an emergency response and made at the particular time. There were some things which came out of it which have been very good, and I think there's a lot of lessons for governments as well. I think in some places it did stabilise, particularly in relation to some of the income management which the Labor governments continued on, and typically it's the women who benefited from the income management because it meant for the first time that there was money available for the purchase of food on the table. Can I pick up a couple of the other things which have been said? And going back to sort of the core critique of funding. Now, yes, we did make some savings in the Indigenous portfolio. As I said, there were small savings in this overall scheme of things. But if we honestly thought that more money was the answer to closing the gap, we would have closed it a long time ago, Stan. And what it represents in a place like, say, Wilcannia, where the Auditor General did a report, is that you have a proliferation of services. Now, in a place like Wilcannia, the Auditor General found there was 102 funded services from 18 different state and federal agencies, with a further 17 proposed, when the Indigenous population there was 474 people. Now, we could double the number of services there, but unless they're absolutely focused on the core fundamentals of getting kids to school, getting adults working, and getting a bed of law and order, then I fear that we could invest more and more money, we won't see the circumstances change. So we are fundamentally trying to streamline some of those services, focus on the core underpinnings of a functional society, work very closely with the Indigenous communities while doing so, with the aim of trying to see greater progress in the years ahead.
I want to come to Shayne Neumann in a moment, but Alan, you mentioned, just on the intervention, you mentioned that the benefits that went to women, particularly with money and being able to use that money more effectively. I want to just repeat something that was said in the earlier session we did today from Yananyimal Mununga, who said that intervention made her feel like an alien in her own country. You've spoken about the need for consultation, and when that is put to the test, it fails time and time again, to the point where a woman can feel as if she is an alien in her own country.
And I think that the nature of the emergency response meant that there wasn't the time to do the consultation, which I think is needed to be done. Now, I'm working, for example, right now in relation to Andrew Forrest's recommendation of a healthy welfare card. Now, I've been deeply engaged with 2 or 3 communities on the ground in relation to that. They are driving the settings, they are determining the parameters, they are having leading discussions in each of their communities in relation to what that will look like. And I consequently think that when you do that, you will get a better outcome. And I hope that we do get a very good outcome. So I think we've learned some of the lessons from the past. I think that you only get very good success when you do have that deep engagement, deep consultation, and have local people on the ground who are helping to, in some respects, determine the policy settings as you go.
Okay, I'll go to Shayne and then we'll go to Rachel. But Shayne, are you prepared to also back Warren's denunciation of Labor's decision to continue aspects of the intervention and the question of consultation and working closely with communities that Alan has raised?
Well, we restored the Racial Discrimination Act and we invested massive amounts of money through national partnerships agreements in the Stronger Futures. And those have been ripped up in large part by the current government. Can I make this point in terms of budget issues, which Alan keeps talking about? Alan, look at budget paper number 2, the 2014-15 budget, $534.4 million cut from Indigenous programs, frontline services. Look at budget paper number 2 in 2015-16. The cuts continue. Part of that, $145.6 million in cuts. And frontline services, family violence prevention legal services cut, women's shelters cut, cuts to funding in terms of language programs, cuts to funding in family support across the country. Look at the Senate inquiry and every submission to the Senate inquiry into the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, which is a shambles, utter chaos and a disgrace. Nearly every single submission excoriates and condemns the Abbott government for what they've done. Who can possibly be opposed to the idea of getting kids to school, people in jobs and safer communities? We support that, but it's much, much more, and the Abbott government stands condemned in terms of their IAS, and the minister doesn't look at the budget papers. He thinks it's bureaucratic reduction, red tape reduction, and the parliamentary secretary today gets up and says this when the budget papers say something entirely different.
Rachel, the question of money, and I think everyone would acknowledge that it is not just an issue of money. And there are differences between a sum of money and the effectiveness of the spending of that money. Is not what the point Alan is making, the point the Prime Minister has made, the point that Warren Mundine has made repeatedly, is that part of the saving comes from the reduction of red tape and bureaucracy that swallows up a lot of the money that could be directly going to communities. If that eases the pathway for the delivery of services, is that not a good thing?
That's not what happened. We are seeing services cut, and as the person that initiated the Senate inquiry into the IAS and has read all the submissions, it is really clear that we have lost services. So if that's the only thing, this is the myth that has been perpetrated by the government, is that it's just about getting rid of red tape. That is false. We have lost services on the ground. And secondly, if it was about getting rid of red tape, why not reinvest that money back into delivering better services on the ground to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities? I do, however, have to say something about the intervention. I had, the day that the intervention was announced, there, just by coincidence, happened to be a group of senior Aboriginal women from Central Australia in Parliament House, and they were actually in my office the day that was announced and as we were hearing it. I will never forget sitting there with those women, seeing the tears rolling down their faces about what was coming at them in terms of the intervention. And the things that they told me then about what it would mean are exactly what happened. We had a Senate inquiry into the legislation that brought the first intervention in. And I'm sorry I'm a bit passionate about this, because the evidence that was presented to that initial inquiry into that legislation said this will disempower people. It is not the right way to go. And oh, by the way, evidence from overseas shows that this sort of approach doesn't work. So what are we doing now? Labor government then continued it. Sorry, guys. When you had the opportunity to get rid of it, you continued it. The evaluation on income management consistently shows that it's not delivering results for the millions and billions of dollars that we have invested in it. That is, and now what we're doing is continuing that process through the Healthy Welfare Card, which is again...
Rachel, in relation to the income management, I mean, with the basis card, 2/3 of people who come off the basis card on a compulsory basis choose to voluntarily stay on it.
Yeah, and if people want to voluntarily do it, that's fine. But look at the results from that evaluation show that it has not worked, nor will the Healthy Welfare Card, because you are taking people's decision-making capacity away from them. And the evidence shows that the services that need to be delivered need to be community-controlled. They need to be making the decisions. And it's same in your personal life. It's building up your capacity to make decisions and not being disempowered by the decisions that are being made for you. So the intervention was wrong from the start. It never should have happened. The ALP government never should have extended it, and it should be abandoned, and we need to go back to doing things very differently.
And Warren Snowden, you'd be sitting there agreeing wholeheartedly with her criticism of your own party, wouldn't you?
Mate, I suppose I am revealing something. I remember the very day that Labor took the decision it was over lunchtime. I remember the discussion very vividly. I won't tell you who the discussion was with. You can probably surmise about, look, where the government's proposing to do this, we think we need to support it. Now, internally, I opposed it heavily. I argued and argued and argued against it. Now, I'm a member of the Labor Party. The decision was taken to support it. Therefore, as a trooper and a part of the team, that's what I did. But at the same time, I was extremely critical of every element of it. And I remain critical of it. And I think what we've got to do is understand the dynamic that happened there. We had Malbrough march into the parliament like a stormtrooper, lay down the law supported by John Howard, basically saying, and people were fearful of this, now wrongly as it turns out, you know, we're going to involve the army. Well, people left their communities because they thought the army was coming to take them away. This happened. So the issue here was not about ultimately whether the intervention worked or not. The issue was how the intervention happened. And if the policy proposals that were being delivered by the intervention had gone through a process and sat down with communities and communities had agreed to them, it's a very different thing. But that's not what happened. It was just an imposition, a gross imposition on the rights of individuals, their communities and families. And whilst there may have been some potentially good outcomes through the stronger futures, a lot more money in housing and other things, that's all well and good. But at its core, the intervention was wrong. I think we've got to understand that governments need to understand and appreciate that you can sit in Canberra and make these decisions, but it's at your peril. And it's at the most importantly though, it's at the peril of people who live in the bush, because they don't get the voice, they get one voice. And when you should be making these decisions, instead of sitting on your big fat backsides in Canberra, go and sit in the bush, sit down in the dirt, talk to the Northern Land Council, talk to the Central Land Council, talk to communities around the Northern Territory and get their response. It'll be very different from the one you assume you're going to get when you leave Canberra. I can guarantee it.
Nova, we just heard from Charlie King, Lani, when she was up here a moment ago talking about the horror of family violence, the abuse that Charlie has said that he'd experienced and seen firsthand. And we know that that was an element of the motivation for the intervention. In terms of the good that could come out of it, as Warren, who was an opponent of it, has acknowledged, is there at least an acknowledgement of the emergency and the good that came out of it, leaving aside, and I don't say that lightly, but leaving aside the issues of the implementation?
We're talking about Australia here. Well, we've got 23 million, and there's only 650,000 Aboriginal people. Yet, Aboriginal Affairs is almost on the front page of the Australian every single day. We're always talking about 2% of the population. So when you talk about violence and all that sort of stuff, it's there, it's always going to be there, no matter what colour you are, black, white, yellow, brindle, whatever, it's always going to be there. But we all know the truth behind the intervention. It was an excuse to disempower Aboriginal people and have access to land. That's the truth of it all. You know, no matter what bloody way you look at it, that's the goddamn truth. So, you know, we hear now all about, you know, the churches with abuse in the churches, and it's rife. It's rife across the world when you talk about abuse. But you're talking about Aboriginal people, and what Warren was saying, you know, they don't have voices, but they've got strong voices, you know, and they continue to fight. And with the whole, if I'll tell my story, with the intervention, I was actually working for OATSI, Office of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health. I was in Alice Springs at the time, and I get a phone call at 11:30 at night to say I'm going to have company going into Hermannsburg the following day. And I was like, what sort of company? So I drove out there with Nathan Blacklock, Bo Delacruz. We were prominent Aboriginal sports people promoting health to Aboriginal kids. So when we get out there, the army truck started to come. And everyone, women and the children stayed. There was not one man in the community. And I had this car pull up to me, and it was Aboriginal men. And they had guns. They thought that they were going to go to war. That's the signal. And they said to me, "Sis, are you all right?" I said, "Yeah, I'm all right." So they left. But they were waiting. That's the message that got out there, that this country was going to war on Aboriginal people. So I understand how wholeheartedly the frustrations of Aboriginal people continuing to fight on a day-to-day basis. What gets me is the yardstick keeps moving for Aboriginal people. You know, we are subjected to 3-year cycles of funding. When something works, the wool gets ripped out from under our feet, and then you've got to start all over again. You give hope and aspirations on 3-year cycles. And the thing is, leadership, right, when you want change, it takes tremendous guts and leaders, i.e. Adam Goodes. He said enough is enough. So you have one man, one black man that won Australian of the Year last year, and when he spoke out, the world said, "Get back in your box, mate. You cannot stand up and use this because you're Australian of the Year." Well, he's a proud black man, and when people know his story, it makes people uncomfortable, and people didn't take too lightly to what he had to say. The problem with this country is, and we saw the intervention happen in 24 hours, Rachel tells the story, no one knew it was coming, but it changed the face of how Australia sees Aboriginal people because we were painted with the one bloody brushstroke, and that's what's happened. We've still never recovered from it. So I was thinking, I've been listening to a lot of the speakers, and Barawa, who I've got so much respect for, was talking about, when I, as a mother, I've got children and a grandson, when your kid gets too far in front of you, say, come back, walk with me, because that's that safeness. So when you talk about leadership, right, we all know that Second World War, the Northern Territory, Northern Australia, Darwin was bombed. Lives were lost. People lost their lives fighting for this country. Aboriginal people, Warren knows this all too well, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women have served at every single war of this country. But why do we, as this country, have such great relationships with Japan? Even though we had a war with them. The Northern Territory, $32 billion infrastructure problem, biggest investment outside of Japan, is on the very place that they bombed. Why? Because the history books said that there was the war and people can accept that that's happened, but you can only move forward when you acknowledge the truth. And right now, this country has a problem with the truth of Aboriginal people. And every time we come out and tell our story, it's like, shut the book, we don't want to deal with it. And until we confront the truth, the intervention, the wounds are still open. My mother, a member of the Stolen Generation, you've got my grandparents who are all members of the Stolen Generation. My grandfather had chains around his goddamn neck. That is the truth of this country. But we keep closing the history books and we have to continue to defend ourselves. Every time we talk, we have to defend ourselves. The problem is, this government needs leadership. When you get people like your Andrew Bolts of the world who says the Stolen Generation is a myth. That's bullshit. It happened and it's real. And, Tony Abbott could pick up the phone and say, mate, sack this person. He's a disgrace to this country. And we have to learn to accept what's happened in this country. And I just want to tell one simple story here. So we continue to fail Aboriginal people. I was down in Katherine the other day at a place called Vendale. It's a rehab program, right? So Aboriginal people, they put their hand up and said, I've got an alcohol problem, drug problem, I want to go there. I was talking to this young fella from Nooka, and the guy who was showing me around, he says to this guy, you was in here just recently. He said, yeah, I come back. He said, did you relapse? He said, no. But if I go back to my community, there's alcohol problems, there's no housing and there's no job. So what a sad place that a man who all he wants to do was work has to come back into rehab just to get a roof over his head and meals, and with the opportunity that he could perhaps put a hat on and just work. That's the pride that Aboriginal people, we want housing. You can't get your bloody kids to school with 20 people in a house. How does a kid get sleep? Go to sleep at night, wake up the next day, go to school. And just the words that we use, keep the community safe, get the kids, they're patronising words to Aboriginal people. That's my ordeal. I get wild and angry. We should have, Aboriginal affairs should be left alone, don't touch it for 10, 15 years, however it takes for a young kid to go to preschool and finish high school. Leave it alone. Let Aboriginal people make the decisions for themselves, but put it in a bucket, because it's sad. It's 2015. We're having this discussion about 2% of Australia's population that gets on the front page of the Australian every single day, and we are criticised and ridiculed for being Aboriginal in this country.
Well, Nova, I have to say I admire your passion. I don't know that I'd agree that I want the Prime Minister calling up to get a journalist sack, because I couldn't guarantee my own employment if that was the case.
But the courts have said,
no, I get that.
What I'm saying is, we get told to shut up at a big level. Adam Goodes gets told to shut up at the MCG. One man in front of her, because he puts his head out the box for being Aboriginal. But I'm saying is, we allow people to have this conversation, and Andrew Bolt wanted to water down the 18C so he can continue his merry way about how he has his perception of Aboriginal people.
Well, I know that Alan Tudge doesn't speak necessarily for the Prime Minister, and certainly doesn't speak for Andrew Bolt, but I do want to go to the substance of this, and this is a debate that is deeply being held in Australia right now, and a couple of things that we just need a very definitive answer on. We hear that the stolen generations was a myth. We hear that there is not necessarily racism at the heart of the Adam Goodes abuse. Is it racist to boo Adam Goodes? Definitively, yes or no? And did the stolen generations happen? Was it a myth?
The stolen generations happened. I've spoken to many people who have told me that that their parents were taken or they themselves were taken. Is it all to do with racism, the booing of Adam Goodes? I think that there's certainly a significant racial element to it, but I don't know if it's all to do with racism. However, I think that certainly many Aboriginal people, and I've read your article as well, a beautiful article, Stand in The Guardian, feel very deeply when something like that occurs, that it is a reflection on them as Aboriginal people. And consequently, I think that it should stop. I don't think it's the booing at any person, frankly, on a continual basis like that, is respectful, is treating them with dignity, let alone a person of the stature of Adam Goodes. An Australian of the Year, one of the greatest players we've ever seen, a man who has done so much for underprivileged people in this country. I think he's one of our superstars. And I suppose my hope, Stan, is that, you know, one day that we not only can accept and celebrate an Adam Goodes because of his prowess on the football field, the work that he does, but also that when he does express his indigeneity and his Aboriginal heritage, that we also accept that, or not even just accept, but also celebrate that. Because we're getting towards that end, but at the end of the day, I don't think we celebrate our Indigenous heritage as much as, say, New Zealand does its Maori heritage. And I'd like to think that we're on a journey towards that, and that should be our ultimate goal, where it's individuals' heritage, but it should be all of our heritage, which we celebrate. And I know that's something that you've said very powerfully as well, Nova, in relation to that point.
Yeah, look, we have opened the issue of Adam Goodes. I do want to get onto constitutional recognition, but before we do that, I'll get a quick response from everyone here. Warren, first of all, the Adam Goodes situation, what's your analysis of it? Do you believe that this is racism, and do you believe it reflects a broader racist element within Australian society, or are we better than that?
I think if I'm not an Aboriginal person, but I think an Aboriginal person would rightly say they think it's racist. And I think they would also say that they confront institutionalised racism every day of their lives. And I think that's the issue here. The fact that people booed him is one thing, and they may have booed them because they went along with the crowd, but there's an element in it that's absolutely racist, that's clear. And if he's back on the football field next week against my team, Geelong, and anyone boos, they are racist. They are racist because they're on a warning. It's very clear that the football community said it is not acceptable, and they've said that they're concerned about the booing of him in Western Australia and what happened. And ultimately, I think it's around people having respect. And if they can't respect his right as an Aboriginal person to play football in the way he does and to show his Aboriginality by doing a war dance, then there's something wrong with us. And so I think we've got to have we non-Aboriginal Australians have got to really have a long, hard look at ourselves about how we deal with Aboriginal people. Can I just go to one point? It's not about that, but you asked before about things, Aboriginal people wanting things and what should happen. Guthalala is not far from here. Guthalala and the outstations around North East Arnhem Land, when we were in government, said they wanted a boarding facility. We provided the funds for the boarding facility at Guthalala. That money was made available. Contracts had initially started to be let. As soon as the Abbott government came in, they stopped the project. There is now no boarding facility at Guthalala. So whilst the government goes on about the importance of education, here's a very direct example where an Aboriginal communities in North East Arnhem Land took a decision about where they wanted to have a boarding facility. It was responded to properly by government, the then government, and I was partly involved in those discussions. Then when the new government came in, they stopped it. Now, it just beggars belief that they should do that, but they did. And it's no wonder that Aboriginal people are disappointed.
Can I make a couple of comments,
Can I just hold the thought? I just want to get a quick response to the Adam Goods situation while we're on it, and then I'll go to Alan. Rachel?
Yes, I do, clearly, but I believe it's clearly racism. And the AFL, instead of saying we can't tell our fans what to do, should have clearly said this is unacceptable. Because if someone with Adam Goods' strength and reputation can feel the way he's been made to feel by those comments, can you imagine how the young people that I heard talk to the Parliamentary Select Committee on Constitutional Recognition, when we were hearing from young people about what it would mean to them and what their lives were like, they told us of experiencing racism in schools, on their ways to school, and trying to stand up against that. So imagine how those people are feeling when they see someone like Adam Goods torn down and vilified. What message does it send to them? So yes, it's clearly racism, and we need to deal with it in this country once and for all.
Shayne?
Yeah, well, I represent an area that once elected Pauline Hanson as the federal member for the area. So don't talk to me about institutionalised racism. Of course, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have experienced more than 200 years of discrimination, dispossession and disadvantage, and they're of course acutely aware of that. We've seen what the Abbott government tried to water down the protection on 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, and they see heroes. We've got wonderful Indigenous heroes, sporting heroes. Nova's one of them. Greg Inglis, Jonathan Thurston, Adam Goods. We see these great heroes. We cheer for them. We're proud when they wear green and gold. And yet, what possesses people like me and other people who look like me to actually yell out abuse and call Adam an ape? I mean, where does that come from? It's something in the deeper, darker past in this country. I believe there's a lot of people with goodwill in this country. I believe the majority of Australians really want recognition, acknowledgement and reconciliation in this country. But somewhere deep down, there's this. And I think we've got to address it. We've got to own up to it. We've got to address it. And Nova's right. We've got to actually accept the truth in this country, and we've got to deal with it, and governments need to deal with it.
Okay, Alan, you wanted to respond to Warren, and then I need to ask you a question about constitutional recognition.
I just wanted to come back to Warren in relation to education policy, and I've had a lot of things thrown at the government here by the other four panel members. I don't know the particular.
You fought your corner well.
I don't know the particular incidents in relation to the boarding school that he's talking about, but in relation to what we've already done in our 18-20 months of being in government, we've engaged student attendance officers in almost 70 remote communities across the country, and that's employing local people on the ground to help get kids to school, empowering those local people. Now, we've got about 13% more kids going to school in the Northern Territory and in Queensland now as a result of that initiative, because of local people are empowered to do that. We've also put money behind the successful Clontarf program so that we can try to double the number of Clontarf academies around the country, because again, it has been so successful in mentoring kids, getting kids to school and then following them into work. We've also put money into the direct instruction program, as you know, to help Noel Pearson's organisation roll out this very effective explicit instruction method, because it has been shown to work. And we're very excited about the progress of this, and we've got communities around the country now who are calling out for this to be introduced into their schools. So there's some very practical things on the ground on the education front, seeing results already, and starting to see better educational outcomes as a result of those things.
We have only a short time left, and I do want to come to we can't get into a debate. We can have the debate, Warren, seriously somewhere else. But I've got a short time left, and I need to address constitutional recognition. You talked about supporting Noel Pearson's education initiatives. Noel Pearson attended the Prime Minister's leadership conference on constitutional recognition and walked away disgusted. He felt as if that was a wasted opportunity and it was contrived and did not move it forward. Where are we at on this? Is it going to happen in the lifetime of this or the next Parliament?
It will, but first of all, certainly not every participant's at that roundtable discussion felt the same way that Noel Pearson did, and I spoke to many of them subsequently. It was a very constructive discussion. It was co-hosted by the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister, with 40 of our most senior Indigenous leaders across the country. What came out of that is a plan ahead, a plan for a number of community conferences around the country to be able to engage Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people to try to determine what model we may take to the Australian people. We haven't set a date yet. We don't want to set a date until we feel as if there's enough community consensus to have a successful referendum. It's an easy thing to say, to get constitutional recognition, but it's actually very difficult to implement.
Well, no, but you have said that constitutional recognition without also an explicit outlawing of racial discrimination in the Constitution won't have the meaning that it should have.
That's right, Stan, and just following on from what Alan was saying with the meeting that we had, I was one of the delegates to that meeting. I think where Noel was coming from, and I can't speak for him, but from what I had read, and I felt that we all walked away in terms of there was a way forward with community conferences, but what needs to be had before the community conference is an Aboriginal convention, and that's what we called for, is to, we'd all had the same opinion that we needed to re-engage with Aboriginal people at a grassroots level to actually discuss the models that we're proposing, because one of the things that we want to ensure that, you know, this country can be discrimination free. You know, we know that there are rights already in the Constitution, and there's been discussion around that if you put to the Australian people, you know, a prohibition against race, that it's going to open up a Bill of Rights. That's not correct. You know, but what we know that you have legislation around the 18C, and the government at the time pushed aside 18C to enact the intervention.
And 18C, just to clarify, is outlawing the vilification of people on the basis of race, gender, religion, and so on.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the importance of having a prohibition against discrimination is we should be proud to live in a country that says, no, it's not okay to discriminate on your race and your ethnicity and on these reasons. You know, your basic fundamental, you know, what makes you a human being. It shouldn't be okay to discriminate. And what a great country Australia could be for it. And Shayne and I were talking about this last week at the Labor Party conference that we had. You know, the expert panel came up with a new section 116, which doesn't even mention Aboriginal people. It just says that the government shall not discriminate on your race, your ethnicity. So for me as an Aboriginal person, we make up 2.5–3% of Australia's population. How do I get, and we talked about this, Shayne, a 27-year-old white male to leave the footy or whatever it may be, give up his Saturday to go and tick a box for an Aboriginal person when we're having discussions about Adam Goods now? Can we really do this as a country? I am probably one of the most optimistic people we could ever meet. I don't think we could. However, that section 116 is inclusive of a modern Australia. You know, it's in terms of, we're such a multicultural country, you know, and that's a way forward. And I think that's what will bring people to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution is a prohibition against race, because, as we know, this country is a modern Australia is made up of multicultural people.
Shayne, we also know that just passing a referendum is nigh on impossible. 8 in the history of the country. Getting a majority of people in a majority of states, the double jeopardy, proves so elusive. A question that would fail, is that better than no question at all?
Well, we can't afford to fail. And I agree with what Nova has to say. I think if people find there's a stake in it for them, for all of us, they'll vote for it. Labor strongly believes in real and substantive change to the Constitution. We have backed in the expert panel, the Joint Select Committee. I'm on that committee as well, and I was in the room with the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition and 40 respected Indigenous leaders. And I do think there's a way forward. Bill Shorten has written to the Prime Minister agreeing with the request of Megan Davis, Kirsty Parker from Congress, from Pat Dodson and Noel Pearson, that we should have Indigenous conferences, an Indigenous-only convention. I agree. I think we should do nothing in terms of changing the Constitution without the support of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They were not there in the 1890s when the Constitution was formed and Australia was federated. They were not there. They had no place. We've got to get rid of the racist provisions in the Constitution. We've got to retain the integrity of the 1967 referendum result. We've got to make sure the Commonwealth and the states and territories think about racial discrimination when they actually pass laws. And we have, in the Joint Select Committee, put forward a number of options that would limit governmental power to pass laws in relation to racial discrimination. We think this is important. I actually think that real and substantive change is far more likely to be accepted by the Australian public than minimal change. And the best example of that is the Republican referendum, where the public saw there was nothing in it for them. They thought it was not a people's president. They thought it as a politician's republic. If the public thinks they support it and they think they've got a stake in it, they'll vote for it.
Okay.
And so Labor strongly believes in real and substantive change.
On that point, though, Rachel, is it not also a political reality that a referendum on constitutional recognition that acts as a cover for potential, as the Prime Minister has said, Bill of Rights, by outlawing racial discrimination, would bring out an opposition campaign that would sink the referendum?
There's a couple of things here. It is clearly not a Bill of Rights, and the Select Committee addresses this in our report, where it goes through a whole lot of other rights that are already built into the Constitution. So that is a nonsense argument. But you are right in terms of the politics of this. I was on both the expert panel and the Parliamentary Select Committee panel. Unfortunately, I wasn't at the summit. The Prime Minister, in my opinion, made a mistake. He didn't make it a multi-party summit, because you're going to need all the political parties, and we do need all political parties engaged in this. But the point here is that, and I should just add, I totally support the proposal about having the specific conventions for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We've always been of the opinion, and it's one of the key items for the Greens to tick the box in terms of supporting the question, is that it has the majority support of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. But the point here is that both through the expert panel and the Select Committee, you'll see the recommendations are basically the same. And that's because both groups went out and talked to the community and came back with basically the same things. We road tested the expert panel recommendations, and that's what the community said. Overwhelmingly, they said we want to address racial discrimination. So the question goes back to whether the Coalition, the ALP, the Greens and the crossbenchers will support, if the conventions support those those proposals, the recommendations similar to the expert panel and Select Committee, will the Coalition in particular go with it? Okay. Go with what the people say. That is the question.
Okay, Warren, I hate to hold you to a minute, but I have to hold you to a minute because this is the tyranny of live events. The question here is... I know. And I know he loves to veer off into all other directions, and I'm going to rein him back in. But the question here that is fundamental, and it's being debated in the Indigenous community vigorously, is whether this should be a symbolic measure, whether it should have legal meaning, whether it should be in the body of the Constitution or a separate acknowledgement. Where do you sit?
I sit precisely where my two colleagues to my left and far left, Nova in this case,
That's usually me.
that's usually you, have made it very clear.
It's normally where Rachel sits.
And I think Alan probably agrees with us as well.
I should be on
So
the
I
other
think,
side, I think.
so I think there it can only be substantive change, but most importantly, we need Prime Minister Abbott to respond positively to the letter that he's received from those 4 eminent Australians about funding a process of Aboriginal conferences and ultimately a convention around the country. That's the least we can do to allow Aboriginal people to express themselves, their voice, in the way they determine.
And less than a minute, so applaud him for that. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming along today. Thank you for watching at home as well. Thank you to all our participants. And I have to say, thank you to you, Alan. You were outnumbered, but you did fight your corner. Thank you.
Thank you.
Could you all please ensure that you're back here at 1:30 p.m. sharp after lunch?